Good evening and a warm welcome. I'm Robert Dijkgraaf. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study and the Leon Levy professor here. No apologies for the weather. I would say yet another perfectly fine Dutch fall day. But some of you must have felt that you were crossing the Red Sea to get to this lecture here. In that vein, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's public lecture on the archaeology and history of Jerusalem in biblical times by Israel Finkelstein, who is the Jacob M. Elko Professor at Archaeology of Israel in the Bronze and Iron Ages at Tel Aviv University. And we have a little bit like a Russian doll, so I will be actually just introducing the introducer here. But before I do that, I would like to convey the Institute's deepest thanks to Jeanette Lerman-Neubauer, who our dear trustee, who's here in the audience with her husband Joe. Jeanette, it was you who reached out to Dr. Finkelstein and made this evening possible. Thank you so very much. It's also a great pleasure to recognize another trustee here, Shelby White, who has also a very long relation with the speaker, and very happy to have you here, Shelby. The study of Greek and Roman history and ancient cultures has a long and important history here at the Institute, particularly the School of Historical Studies. It started in 1935, at the very beginning, when Benjamin Barrett was appointed Professor of Greek Epigraphy. Archaeology was added in the following year by the appointment of Hattie Goldman, who was also our first woman as professor, and was Latin Paleography with the appointment of Lowe. And then later, Eastern archaeology came under the aegis of Ernst Hertzfeld. From the foundation, the strong and diverse program in Greek and Roman studies was built up, and after the Second World War, Homer Thompson took over as professor of Greek archaeology in 1947. With the retirement of merit, Christian Habicht came to the Institute, became professor of Greek history, and assumed responsibility for our extensive collection of squeezes, these three-dimensional impressions of ancient impressions, and of course, we all dearly miss Professor Habicht, who passed away this summer. Merit had built up this major research center here in Greek epigraphy at the IES, and we are very proud of that. By the way, initiative to digitize this Institute squeeze selection is currently underway, with generous gifts provided by Institute friend Annette Merle-Smith and the Charles and Lisa Simoni Fund for Arts and Sciences. So I would say the strong tradition of study in the ancient world continues with Angelos Kaniotis, who has been serving here as the school's professor since 2010. He is very much active here at the Institute across the world. There's strong suspicions he's part of a triplet, given this range of activities. But I also would like to thank, both thank Angelos and Nathan Arrington, associate professor in the program of archaeology at Princeton University, for co-organizing tonight's lecture. And with these brief words, let me welcome the true introducer, Angelos Kaniotis. Thank you.
There was a time when people believed that they knew the exact date of the creation of the world, although there was some controversy about it, whether it was the 1st of September of 5509, according to the Christian calendar, or October 6, 3761, according to the Hebrew calendar. Then science came and suggested that this calculation might be wrong by several billion years if we think of the Big Bang, or several million years if we consider the emergence of life. There was a time when the history of Israel, and more generally the Near East, was based on facts given in the Bible, for instance, on narratives about the Exodus or the great kingdom ruled by David and Solomon, that was later split into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And then archaeological research came, confronting the historical scenarios of the Bible with the data provided by excavations and asking uncomfortable questions. Was there ever an Exodus? What kind of a kingdom David and Solomon ruled? Was there a monotheistic religion in Israel in the late Bronze and early Iron Age? There was a time when a discipline that sought to unearth remains of material culture in the Near East was labeled biblical archaeology. and then the cooperation between archaeological research and the natural, life, and exact sciences came, transforming an archaeological discipline from a servant of Old Testament studies, from the archaeology of a text, to the archaeology of human beings. One of the leading figures in the formation of modern Bronze and early Iron Age archaeology in Israel is our speaker, Israel Finkelstein, the Jacob Alcock Professor of the Archaeology of Israel in the Bronze and Iron Ages at Tel Aviv University, where he has been teaching since 1990 after holding professorial positions at Bar Ilan University and the University of Chicago. Professor Finkelstein's fieldwork is extremely impressive, including excavations of Bronze and early Iron Age sites near Tel Aviv, in the Sinai, in the Beersheba Valley, and surveys in the southern Samaria. But his most important long-term projects are the excavation of the city of Megiddo for 25 years now, one of the most important sites in the Levant, and a key site for understanding the late 2nd and the early 1st millennia BC. And more recently, the excavations of sites in the Negev highlands. For decades, Professor Finkelstein has been a pioneer in the use of diverse scientific methods for the analysis of archaeological finds. He was a principal investigator of the project Reconstructing Ancient Israel, the Exact and Life Sciences Perspectives, that was funded by the European Research Council from 2009 to 2014. In addition to numerous monographs in which he presented in an exemplary manner the results of his numerous excavations, he has written 2 best-selling books for a general audience together with Neil Asher Zilberman, The Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text, 2001, and David and Solomon, In Search of the Bible's Sacred Kings and the Roots of the Western Tradition, in 2006. He has received many honors for his research, including membership in the Israel Academy of Sciences and the Humanities and the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres as a correspondant étranger, the Dan David Prize for his radical revision of the history of Israel in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE in 2005. In 2009, he was made Chevalier in the Order of Arts and Letters in France. And I stop here. He also holds an honorary degree from the University of Lausanne. The popular image of an archaeologist has been informed by the Indiana Jones movies. And indeed, in real archaeological excavations, there is plenty of romance. There are snakes and scorpions. There are mysteries to be solved, and sometimes also treasures to be found. But there are also fist fights. Yes, there are, although only in a metaphorical sense, taking place in the pages of books, in newspapers, and blogs. When new radical interpretations are proposed, they are not accepted without a fight. Unsurprisingly, Professor Finkelstein's reconstruction of the early history of Israel has not found followers among people who are more willing to trust an ideologically colored book written by human hand than the results of scholarly and scientific research. But his research has transformed the way we now view and study the early history of the Levant, and today he will be speaking on Jerusalem in biblical times. After his lecture, there will be the possibility for you to ask questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Israel Finkelstein.
Thank you very much, Angelos, for this introduction, and thank you all for coming in this stormy weather today. And many thanks to the Institute for inviting me to this fascinating place and for the wonderful treat here while I'm at Princeton. I am not going to speak about every detail in the history and archaeology of Jerusalem this evening. I will basically outline several important notes about the history of this wonderful city, very central to our civilization, in the period of time between the late Bronze Age and the Hellenistic period in the late 2nd century BC. So before we start with actual history and archaeology, let me say a few words of introduction in order to introduce the site, the place to you, for those of you who may have not been in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, from the topography point of view, is divided into three major parts. The Temple Mount is the highest point of the old city of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem, this picture was taken in the 1930s, and I find it very illuminating because it is not disturbed by the urban complex of modern days. So the Temple Mount in the center. To the south of the Temple Mount, there's this ridge which is known in archaeological research as the City of David. I always say, quote unquote, the City of David, because the City of David is a term that we do find in the Bible. However, we do not exactly know where it is. So it's a kind of sort of an interpretation of biblical scholars that this is the place. And then to the west of the Temple Mount, there's the Upper City, a term taken from Second Temple Jerusalem, the Jewish quarter of today, which was part of the Iron Age city at a certain time. So these are the three components. And then, of course, there is the spring, which I mark here in the valley of the Kidron, the spring, which is the life of Jerusalem, Jerusalem being located on the desert fringe. In fact, if one walks about 1 kilometer from the Temple Mount to the east, one finds herself in the desert, on the desert fringe. Then let me say a few words about archaeological research in Jerusalem, because this reflects on what I'm going to tell you, because I mean the evidence that I'm going to present is based indeed on many excavations and even local small investigations. So I suppose that I will not exaggerate much if I say that the City of David, again quote unquote, is probably the most excavated piece of land on the face of the earth. It is about 350 meters long, 400 meters long. In some places it is 60, 70 meters broad, not more than that. And almost every part of it has been excavated during the last, what can I say, 130 years or so. So the accumulation of evidence, archaeological evidence, for this part of Jerusalem is very solid and impressive. The most important question that we are facing is the location of the Mound of Jerusalem. We are all used to those features out there in the Levant, the mounds, the tells, the accumulation of many centuries of human activity, and with many layers one on top of the other. And we are looking also for the mound of the site of Jerusalem. But this is a major problem, because the City of David has been considered by many as the place, as the mound of biblical Jerusalem, also the Bronze Age city of Jerusalem, which is mentioned in the 14th century in Egyptian documents from the time of Amenophis III and Amenophis IV, the pharaohs, during the Amarna period. So is this the place? Is this the Mound of Jerusalem? This is a very critical question for what I'm going to say next. And my answer is that there are many very serious problems regarding this identification, and I'm putting them here on the screen. First of all, most phases in the Bronze and Iron Ages are not represented along the ridge of the City of David, again, which has been considered as the Mound of ancient Jerusalem. And then, even more so, periods for which we have solid evidence of habitation in Jerusalem and as an important place are not represented. First and foremost, let's pay attention to the 14th century BC. Jerusalem then was a hub of a city-state which corresponded with Egyptian authorities, the imperial Egyptian authorities of the time. We even know the name of the monarch, petty monarch in Jerusalem. However, along the ridge of the City of David, there are no finds, or almost no finds from this period. Also, most of the finds are only near the springs, and most of the periods are not represented in other parts of the ridge. And then there is a problem of no city wall. I'll return to this one in parts of around or on part of the ridge of the city of David. And then there is also the topographical issue. It is not well located topographically. So let me give you an example. For instance, let's have a look at this nice picture taken to the north with the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque in the background. We can see that there are fortifications on the eastern side of the ridge of the city of David. However, 130 and more years of excavations in Jerusalem have not revealed any trace of fortification on the western side. And this is quite annoying from if one tries to understand the nature of the site and decide that Jerusalem should be the Mount of Jerusalem should be located on the city of David ridge. Secondly is the topographical issue. This is a picture that I took maybe a year ago, just while walking down to the city of David after parking my car near the wall of the old city of today. And you can see the topographical inferiority of the ridge from all sides, from all four sides. And of course, though in antiquity, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, they did not have mortars and guns, still, it is a topographical inferiority that we have to take into consideration when we come to decide about the location of the ancient mound. So, about 10 years ago, with some of my colleagues at Tel Aviv University, we revived the old theory that, in fact, suggested by several scholars, recently 20 years ago by a German biblical scholar, Axel Knauf, that in fact the mound of ancient Jerusalem should be sought for on the Temple Mount. So is this possible? This is a picture of the Temple Mount, again in the 1930s, looking to the south. The only disadvantage is that the Temple Mount is a little bit away from the water, from the spring. However, it is in a very good location from the topographic point of view, and there is enough space. I'm marking here with a yellow sign, yellow circle. There's enough space there to plant, so to speak, a mound. The typical mounds in the highlands of the Near East are about, say, 5, 6, the bigger ones are about 5 or 6 hectares in size. And here I have just planted a tel of about 5 or 6 hectares on the Temple Mount, showing you that there is enough space, because the platform of the Temple Mount, as we see today, the creation of King Herod the Great in the 1st century BC, is about 450 meters long and 250 meters wide. So there's enough space here for a mound. And unfortunately, of course, it is impossible to excavate on the Temple Mount unless one of you really wishes to have the Third World War tomorrow morning, which I am not suggesting here. So there is no way to excavate on the Temple Mount. The sensitivities are there from all communities, both on the Muslim side and on the Jewish side. So this is not something that can be done in the foreseen future. And even if there was a possibility to excavate on the Temple Mount, I doubt very much if much would have been recognized, because of the immense work undertaken there by King Herod the Great in the 1st century BC, which probably simply eradicated most of the remains that were there before him in this complex construction of his own temple, the second temple in the history of Jerusalem. So if this is the case, and the Mount of Jerusalem is on the Temple Mount, which, as you'll see soon, is going to be a very, well, it's good news, because it's going to solve some of the problems. I can always say, well, we don't have evidence, so the evidence is there in the Temple Mount. This is a good solution, maybe. But there are also some very monumental remains near the spring. So the question is how to understand, for instance, in this picture that you can see now on the screen, these are very monumental Middle Bronze fortifications around the spring. So how to understand this if the town itself, with probably palace and temple, is about 300 meters away? I would say, and I think that even in the last few weeks, there's more evidence for this in Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem there's always an excavation going on, and you always need to be with your hand on the pulse in order to be up to date with your interpretation of the finds. So I think that there is good evidence for fortresses which were built up above the spring in order to protect the spring, even if these fortresses were a little bit away from the main part of the city. Finally, before going into the details, let me just say a word about chronology, because as Angelos said before, many of us until 30, 40 years ago were in the business of dating monuments according to our understanding of biblical verses. However, this proved to be a problematic way of dealing with the chronology of the Levant. More and more information accumulated in the, I would say, 70s and 80s to put a question mark on this kind of interpretation. And about, what can I say, 20 years ago, we all turned, or most of us turned, to radiocarbon dating. And today we are all radiocarbon ruled, so to speak, or dictated, so to speak. And what I'm showing you here is the framework for the chronology of the monuments, Iron Age monuments in the Levant, which is radiocarbon dated. This is from an article that I published with a colleague from Tel Aviv University in the journal Antiquity about 8 years ago or so. So we are dating according to this in order to, according to one's interpretation of this or that biblical verse. So now we are done with the introduction, and I'm going to speak about 4 phases in the history of Jerusalem. They are presented to you on the screen. So the formative phase until the middle of the 9th century, the first leap forward, I call it, from the middle of the 9th century until the middle of the 8th. Then a fully developed capital of territorial kingdom from the second half of the 8th century until the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586. And then I have a comment on the period which followed. So let me start with this one, with the formative phase, until the middle of the 9th century. So in the late Bronze Age, as I mentioned before, we are in a big problem because we have written sources, the Amarna letters of the 14th century BC, telling us that Jerusalem was an important place. It was a hub of a city-state, and the king was a major figure in the politics of Canaan at that time, corresponding with the pharaohs and also trying to be involved in the politics of regions which are far away from Jerusalem. However, in the city of David, near the spring, there are almost no remains from this period. So there is no escape, in my opinion, then arguing that the mound was again on the Temple Mount over there. And this is the beginning of Jerusalem in the Bronze Age, in the 2nd millennium, perhaps even in the 3rd millennium BC. As you can see on the left of the picture, one of the Amarna tablets of Jerusalem, and the map showing you that the countryside of Jerusalem is still very sparsely inhabited at that time. And this situation continued also in the Iron Age, beginning of the Iron Age, which means, let's say that the transition from the late Bronze to the Iron Age is around the middle of the end of the 12th century BC. So in the 11th century, in the beginning of the 10th century, this was the situation, continuing of the same conditions. The only change is a slight intensification of settlement activity in the highlands of Jerusalem, because when we come to reconstruct history, we always need to take a look at the city, at the center, but also the countryside, because the relationship between center and the periphery, the countryside, is highly important for our understanding of a location like this. And indeed, it should not come as a big surprise that when we do have the first extra biblical evidence for Canaan, I would call it still, of the 10th century, there is no trace of Jerusalem or Judah. I am referring here to the list of places taken over by Pharaoh Shoshenq I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty in Egypt, left for us on the wall of the Temple of Amun at Karnak in Upper Egypt, and places in the highlands north of Jerusalem are mentioned, and places in the Jezreel Valley, including Megiddo, where I excavate, are mentioned. At Megiddo, there's even a broken stele of Sheshonq the first, which was found during the excavations of the University of Chicago in the 20s, in fact. However, Jerusalem is not mentioned, neither any city in the highlands of Judah, let's say Hebron, Bethlehem, or in the Shephelah, Lachish, Lachish, or other places. Nothing is mentioned, apparently signaling to us that this was not yet a very important part to raise the appetite of the Egyptian monarch who came to Canaan in order to try re-establish the great kingdom of his forefathers of the new kingdom. So on this background, we have to ask a question, because Sheshonq came to Canaan in the second half of the 10th century, and we are there in the time of David and Solomon. So what was the nature of the city in the time of David and Solomon, the founders of the biblically described great united monarchy of Israel? And indeed, there was an immense effort by archaeologists in the last, century or so to identify monuments from the time of David and Solomon, because this was the key to present evidence on the ground for this fabulous golden age of ancient Israel in the 10th century BC, biblically described in such a beautiful way in the books of Samuel and in the books of Kings, in the book of Kings. And in the last 20 or 30 years, there were 3 monuments which were presented to the scholarly community and to the public as evidence for the great united monarchy of David and Solomon. I'm showing you here on the left-hand side the great stone structure excavated by our colleague Eilat Mazar and identified as the palace of King David. And on the right-hand side up, you can see the stepped stone structure, which is some sort of a revetment, a support for this building on the left. And the 2 of them were presented as evidence for the great united monarchy. Here is the reconstruction of Eilat Mazar and other scholars showing the support on the slope, because the slope is very steep over there, and the spring is down below, and the palace and the building. And here on the right-hand side is even a better reconstruction of how some scholars see the situation. However, when we archaeologists have the bad temper of looking into details, and this is devastating sometimes. And in this case, in fact, when one looks very carefully into the details of, boring facts such as elevations and foundations and pottery and ceramics and then radiocarbon dates and so on, the situation becomes more and more complex. And in fact, I think that there is strong evidence that we are dealing with structures which could not have been built before the 9th century BC. And I think the evidence is quite solid. So here we are again with the same question, since most of us, me included, do not doubt the historicity of David and Solomon as the founders of the kingdom of Judah and the house of David, the Davidic dynasty in Jerusalem. We are again in a situation now, I would say we are in a better situation now than 10 years ago, because now we can point to the Temple Mount and say, well, maybe the core of the city is there. So it was not a big city, it was not a fabulous golden age, but there was something there. I'm saying this, that there was no big city on the Temple Mount, because though it is impossible to excavate on the Temple Mount, we do have evidence from there. How is that? There have been several archaeological works conducted, I'll speak about it in a few minutes from now, around the Temple Mount. And on the slopes of the Temple Mount, one could really expect to find the sherds evidence, pottery evidence, that would give you some sort of an idea about the settlement history of the supposed mound on top of the hill. And when one looks at the finds, one sees that the major periods in the history of Jerusalem, such as the, let's say, 8th and 7th centuries, and then later the Hellenistic periods, are very well represented. However, the other periods, including the 10th century and the late Bronze Age, are there, but they are not very strong. So this means that apparently the settlement on top of the hill was modest in size and also in prosperity. So the same can be said about this structure, which is which also probably represents several phases of construction. And I think that the evidence that comes from pottery that was collected from between the courses of the step structure gave us indication that it could not have been built before the 9th century BC. This brings us to the very intriguing question of the distance between the finds on the ground and wishful thinking. And whenever I go to Jerusalem and I look, I took 2 of the reconstructions for you, but there are other, and those of you who visited the site could see elaborate reconstructions of or restoration of how the city should have been should look like. And I can tell you that much of what you see does not exist, in fact. I mean, it all comes from one's interpretation of, not even the interpretation of the biblical text, but understanding what the text must have tried to tell us about Jerusalem, something like that. Because, for instance, the fortification of Jerusalem does not exist before the 8th century. So here we have a fortification for the 10th century BC. And the fortification for the Temple Mount, and things like this. So this is really interesting methodologically. When we speak to our students, I'm always showing them this, and I'm telling them, well, here is the distance between what we are doing today and what he or she can dream or wish to have about the history of Jerusalem. Still, the Temple Mount should not be forgotten, of course. And we should say up front, that, as I mentioned already, that the historicity of the founders of the Davidic dynasty, in my opinion, cannot be doubted, cannot be challenged. And the reason, one of the reasons, there are many reasons for this, but one of the reasons is this inscription that was found 20 years ago or so in the northern side of Dan in Israel, and it was written by a Damascene monarch, Hazael, who is also mentioned in the Bible, and he was the king of Damascus in the late 9th century and a bitter enemy of the northern kingdom of Israel at the time. And he tells in the inscription how he defeated the king of the northern kingdom, the king of Israel, and then he says, and the king of the house of David, which means he titles the southern kingdom, the southern of the 2 Hebrew kingdoms, house of David, because he knows that the founder of the dynasty was David. And this is something in the genre of the Assyrians, for instance, in some of their inscriptions, referring to the northern kingdom as Bit Umri, the house of Omri, which means acknowledging that Omri was the founder of the palace, of the capital, of the main important dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel, when the 2 Hebrew kingdoms lived side by side. So this inscription is important, and there is no, in my opinion, there is no reason to doubt that there was, the typical Levantine, Middle Eastern temple and shrine, palace and dynastic shrine on the Temple Mount. So this is something that we cannot prove, of course, for the reasons that I described, but we can assume, I think, quite securely. A few words about writing, because this is essential for understanding, in my opinion, of the biblical text and other issues that have to do with culture and material culture. Here, too, there has been a revolution in the last few years. Before, inscriptions were dated. Most of the inscriptions are not found in good context, and they were dated according to assumptions regarding paleography. Assumptions, when checked by running algorithms that compare handwritings on, let's say, Hebrew ostraka, the answer is less than promising regarding the conventional wisdom on the development of Hebrew letters, characters in the Iron Age. And also now we are into dating the inscriptions according to the archaeological context, if possible, for those possible. What we see in the case of Jerusalem is that there are no inscriptions before, in my opinion, the second half of the 9th century. Some will tell you, will give you an earlier period. But as far as I understand, this is the earliest. It is not even Hebrew yet. It is Proto-Canaanite. This is the way we understand the beginning of alphabetic writing in the Levant. And it is from the second half of the 9th century, telling you that Proto-Canaanite lingered relatively late, until the late 9th century, in parallel to the rise of Hebrew script, if you wish, in other places. But this carries with it implications to our understanding of the possibilities of dating biblical texts, and I'm not going to go into this. So we were in the formative period, and let me now shift from here to the first leap forward, because this is really the moment that something happens. Starting in the middle of the 9th century. And this comes from excavations in the last, I would say 20 years, not more than that. So let's see, there are 3 places which have been excavated south of the Temple Mount, south of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and all of them revealed some indication for quite meaningful remains from what we call in archaeology the Iron 2A. If I translate it to a better term to understand, I would say the 9th century BC. So here we are. First of all, I'm giving you with a red circle the place. There are the remains that I have already described that are from the 9th century above the spring. Secondly, the second place is not so far from there, maybe 150 meters or so to the northeast. There is another excavation in a place in Jerusalem which is described by archaeologists as the Ophel, another term that comes from the Hebrew Bible, another term that we do not know how to locate really exactly in the topography of ancient Jerusalem. So it's a scholarly invention to identify the Ophel in this place, but as a technical term, it's okay. And here, because a pocket was created between the slope of bedrock and all sorts of construction, we have preservation of Iron Age of 9th century remains, very impressive. The corner of the building that you can see over here stands like 5 meters high. This is a building probably was constructed in the 9th century BC, so it's a very monumental one. And then the third location is to the south of the Dung Gate, excavations that are going on, still going on, a very interesting place in Jerusalem, because this is almost the only last place available for large-scale excavations to reveal the very beginning of Jerusalem's history, if you wish. So this is an important place. And down in the bottom on bedrock, in the place that I marked with a circle, with this ellipse there, 9th century remains were found. So altogether, let's have a look. Here we have the beginning of expansion of Jerusalem. If we speak about a mound of about 5 hectares, let's say 5-6 hectares, until the middle of the 9th century, including the time of the founders of the Davidic dynasty, now we are speaking about a settlement which is twice as big, which means about 9 hectares, something like that. And the part which I mark in red is not yet fortified. However, there is reason to suggest that the mound on the mount had already been fortified at that time. And why am I saying this? Because of a chronistic verse in the 2nd book of Kings describing a confrontation between the king of Israel named Joash and the king of Judah named Amaziah. And there the text in a chronistic way, which is probably reliable, I suppose, historically, tells about the defeat of Judah in the hands of Israel, the northern kingdom, and then the northern king comes to Jerusalem and he breaks the wall of Jerusalem. So there is no wall of Jerusalem to break in the 9th century unless the mound on the mount was fortified, and there is a supporting piece of evidence for what I'm saying. Before I will show you the supporting piece of evidence, we can go right there and then come back. In Judah, in other places in Judah, we do have evidence for fortified towns starting in the 9th century BC. So here is the site of Mitzpah, north of Jerusalem. This is Bet Shemesh, west of Jerusalem, and this is Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem, and they are all heavily fortified already in the second half, apparently, of the 9th century. And together with the expansion of Jerusalem, we see also first indications of maybe more sophisticated administration in these bule that were found near the spring, many of them, about 200 of them, They are not inscribed yet, but still they show some sort of administration of bringing shipping commodities to and from Jerusalem. So at the same time, I'm speaking about this first leap forward, which took place starting in the middle of the 9th century. We also have expansion of settlement activity in the highlands to the south of Jerusalem. And there is also an historical circumstance that can explain what happened. And this is important to remember, because I will come to this point when I wrap up the presentation in a while. That apparently Jerusalem manages to expand, Judah manages to expand to the west and to the south, because in the beginning it was mainly in the highlands around Jerusalem, as it used to be in the late Bronze Age. But at a certain point, Jerusalem expands both to the west, to the Shephelah, and to the south, into the Beersheba Valley. And there's good reason to suggest that this happened under the domination of this same Damascene king, whom I mentioned before, Hazael, who is also referred to in another chronistic verse in the book of Kings. So this was the intermediate phase when Jerusalem starts expanding, and now we come to the fully developed city. Really, at a certain point, Jerusalem, now think about it, Jerusalem location. It is a God-forsaken place, mind you, located on the southern fringe, a few hundred meters away from the desert fringe. Supply of water is not that great. Possibilities of agriculture are not that great. There is no oil around, and not even today, and no big port or something like that. No important highway crossing the Levant and passing in Jerusalem. So why is it there? What's going on? Because at a certain point in the late 8th century, Jerusalem is becoming the biggest city in the Levant. So it grows. Let me just give you a reminder. Here's the situation. Let's say until I would take a risk and tell you when the risk comes from understanding of nitty-gritty pottery assemblages, okay? But let me take a risk, and then radiocarbon dating. Let me take a risk and say that this is the situation until the middle of the 8th century, until 750 BC. And I'm going to show you now a picture, and you can compare, of the situation 50 years later. So here we are 50 years later. All of a sudden, Jerusalem grows in a quite amazing way from about 9 hectares to 60 hectares and more, very densely inhabited. So the population grows from, what can I say, maybe 2,000 to 1,200 or something like that in a very short period of time. And this is the biggest town, the biggest city at that time in the Levant. So one needs to explain what's going on here. How did it happen exactly? Who are these people? Where did they come from? And why Jerusalem became so important? So for the first time, it is fortified now. So here we have the first big fortifications of Jerusalem. And again, there is now you understand what I told you before, there is no need for a fortification here on this side, because this is all part of one expansion of the city to the south and also to the west, to include the parts which are now Mount Zion over here and the Jewish quarter, Armenian quarter and Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. So there are fortifications and there are elaborate monumental building activities regarding transportation of water, solving the water problem, the Siloam Tunnel, and the very elaborate monumental tombs for the affluent personalities in Jerusalem of the time, and also really the first strong evidence for writing, including the famous Siloam inscription, which is now in the museum in Istanbul that you see, telling the story of the cutting of the tunnel in the probably late 8th century, perhaps the beginning of the 7th century BC, but in any event around 700 BC. And at the same time, there is an incredible prosperity in the highlands and in the Shephelah. So Jerusalem goes hand in hand with what's going on around it. Also the countryside to the south in the highlands and in the lowlands to the west. Now, how can one explain this? This is a histogram showing you showing you the population of Judah, calculated according to the number of places inhabited, their size, and then a factor of density of occupation on a built-up hectare. And if I have a big mistake here, the mistake goes throughout. So we are speaking about a tremendous growth in a very short period of time. So the question is how to understand it. And I think that there is enough evidence. I mean, my theories about this are challenged by some, but I think that there's good reason to suggest that there was a movement of people from the territory of the northern kingdom, which had been taken over by the Assyrians in 720, 722, 720 BC. So people moved to Judah. Why? We don't exactly understand whether there was some sort of a connection, cultural connection still between the two Hebrew kingdoms, of course, which is possible. We are not going to go into this, including some sort of religious affiliation. But in any event, what we see is not only the expansion, demographic expansion in Jerusalem and around it, but also demographic depletion in the area that I'm marking here with this square, red square, to the north of Jerusalem in the territory which was ruled at that time by the Assyrian Empire. And this finds also expression in the material culture, because this is the first time that we have evidence for items of material culture known in the northern kingdom in the 9th century, and they appear for the first time in Judah about a century later. Such as, I'm giving you two examples here. One example is the olive oil installations, mass industry of olive oil, which is known in the north before Judah. And those installations appear in Judah a while later. And here we have the famous Proto-Ionic capitals, which appear in the north in the 9th century, even in the beginning of the 9th century. And I don't think that we have them in Judah before the late 8th century, at the earliest. So there are pieces of evidence for these people coming also and bringing with them their items of material culture. And also bringing with them, and this is something that we need to acknowledge if we speak about this demographic situation. And believe me, it is extremely difficult to challenge the demographic situation, because, okay, one can tell me that the middle period is not until 750, but until 751 and a half. So what? I mean, basically, the evidence is there, and we have to work with the evidence. So another thing to remember is the cultural part, which has to do with the biblical record. As you know, I suppose, when we read the Bible today, we can find in the Bible texts which came from the north. These are northern texts which have been, at a certain time, were incorporated into the corpus. A very good example is the Jacob cycle, the early layer in the Jacob cycle, which comes from the Gilead in Transjordan. That was part of the territory of the northern kingdom. And there are other northern stories, such as the heroic tales in the book of Judges, for instance, which are typically northern in character, and they take place in northern locations. And there are other texts, including, you know, the famous Exodus story, which also probably comes from the north, and so on. So the question is, though these are kind of texts which are, how to say, okay, they can be included easily into the Judahite corpus, but there are texts which are hostile to the traditions of Judah, such as the soul traditions, the voice that you can hear in the book of Samuel telling not so good things about King David, and then there's a voice answering this voice and saying, well, no, let me tell you what really happened, or something like that. So these texts were incorporated, in my opinion, into the corpus because of the demographic situation in Judah at that time, that we are speaking about Judah, which is Judah and Israel together. In fact, the idea of a great united monarchy of Israel and Judah probably comes from the situation on the ground, but not in the 10th century, but in Judah and Jerusalem of the late 8th century and onward, and possibly also taking ideas from Israelite ideology, doctrine before. And then there is this moment that Jerusalem is destroyed. And we have evidence for the destruction. I'm giving you one piece of evidence. Really now, while we are speaking, there is an excavation going on in the city of David with very interesting evidence for the last moments of Jerusalem under the attack of the Babylonians in the beginning of the 6th century. In many places in Jerusalem, the evidence for destruction is not overwhelming, let's say. Not very clear, but there are places where the evidence is strong, including this collection of bulle found on the eastern slope of the city of David. So now, in order to wrap up, let me first of all just say a few words, very short ones. I have, I think, 4 minutes. I'm trying to be, on time. So let me say a few words about what happened after, because what happened after is extremely important. There is a tendency in biblical scholarship today to push as many biblical texts as possible into the period after 586, which means into the Persian period and into the early Hellenistic. That is to say, starting, let's say, in the 6th century and until the late 3rd or middle of the 3rd century BC. And as usual, one needs to take a look at archaeology in order to see whether this tendency, has really strong foundations on the ground. So let me just say the following. First of all, there are very few finds from the Persian period all over Jerusalem. In the Jewish quarter, in the Armenian quarter, in the city of David, almost nothing. Here and there are still impressions, but for instance, in all this area, there is no single building from this period so far. I'm always saying in Jerusalem, you can never know, so far. And then also in the Temple Mount, the investigation around the Temple Mount revealed very little in the way of Persian period and early Hellenistic finds. So then this is important, and it changed this situation, and also very important to say, while in the 7th century there is this prosperity of scribal activity in Judah, in all media of scribal activity, bulle, ostraka, and so on. After 586, all this disappeared. We have a group that works under my supervision at Tel Aviv University with mathematicians. We have recently published an article in the PNAS, in the Proceedings of the National Academy here in the United States, showing that we can really calculate, the number of people capable of writing in a godforsaken place in the south of Judah, in Arad, in the south. So this is the situation until 586. After 586, all this disappears altogether, and we have almost nothing until the middle of the 4th century, when all of a sudden we have here and there a coin, and then the scribal activity picks up speed again only in the 2nd century under the Hasmoneans. So, and then in the time of the Hasmoneans, Jerusalem is again surrounded by big fortifications, and this probably took place, in my opinion, in the time of John Hyrcanus in the second half of the 2nd century BC. And then the city again expands to cover the entire area of the destroyed Judahite city of the 7th century BC. So this is something to remember, that we have a problem. Usually my advice to my friends, biblical scholars, there are some of them here among us, my advice is to be very careful with this dating of biblical texts to Judah and Yehud, the province of Yehud, Judah of the time, until the 2nd century. Better to put as many texts in the 7th century, possibly even before, and to the Hasmonean period, unless one argues for writing in the Jewish communities. At that time, we can already call them Jews, in the Jewish communities in the diaspora, in Babylonia and in Egypt. This is just something on the side. So let me wrap it up and ask the following question. This is the most important question that summarizes the whole thing. I have already described to you how Jerusalem is not an important place from the environmental, strategic perspectives. It is not sitting on a main highway, it is not sitting next to a port, no oil, we said that already, and so on and so forth. It's really on the margin. If one looks, for instance, into the southern Levant, so of course as a patriot of Megiddo, I would say Megiddo is the place to become important. Samaria, of course, the capital of the northern kingdom. Nablus, Shechem is an important place from the topographic point of view, from the geography point of view, but not so much Jerusalem. So how is it that in certain periods it becomes so important? So my answer is that Jerusalem becomes important when it serves the politics and the needs of great empires. Because it was weak, it was left there, and it survived, for instance, after the takeover of the northern kingdom by Assyria. And then Judah prospered because it served the Assyrian interests. You can see the location here with the yellow square there. Location of Judah on the border of Egypt, on the border of the desert, very near to the great roads that came from Arabia, carrying with them exotic commodities to the ports of the Mediterranean. So Judah, as a vassal serving Assyria, this was the moment that Judah could really flourish in a meaningful way. And this is the moment in the late 8th century, in the Assyrian century, which starts, let's say, around 732 and continues until 630 or so for 1 century. This was also the moment under Damascene auspices, I think, in the second half of the 9th century. And this, of course, was the situation when Judah was a client of the great empire of Rome. Herod the Great was a client of the Roman Empire, and this is a rehearsal of exactly the same situation as we can see under Assyria in the 8th century BC. Still, it is an important place. Thank you.